Continuing our quest to master the debugging tools in Visual Studio, I'm going to cover trace points, attaching a debugger to a running process, and debugging a website. So let's get started. I'm inside this solution called Other Debugging Techniques, and it contains two projects, Attach to Console and Debug Web App. I'm going to start by showing you something called a trace point. To do that, I'm going to double-click on this program.cs. If you've watched the other movies in this chapter, you know that you can add a breakpoint by clicking in this margin or pressing F9. A breakpoint is hit if you're attached to a debugger and you run this line of code. It will then stop and let you look at your code. A trace point is similar to a breakpoint. When you establish a trace point, you also specify additional action that can be taken when it is hit. Let me show you. I'm going to right-click on this breakpoint and choose when hit. Now, it doesn't actually say the word trace point in here, but this is where you enable a trace point. I click here, and then I get to choose what happens when the debugger encounters this trace point. First of all, I can have it output information to the output window. I can have it do this silently. If this continue execution check mark is checked, then it'll print this output to the output window, but it won't stop and let me look at the code. Let me add a custom string at the front of this so we can find it easily. And then this is going to print the function name, and this is going to print the thread ID and the thread's name. As you can see, there are other variables I can inject in there. I can also do other actions like run macros. And macros are covered in another chapter in this title. Macros are little bits of code that you can run from within Visual Studio. I'm just going to do this basic trace point. Make sure I uncheck this run the macro first. Click on OK. Notice it has a diamond now instead of a circle. That's how I know it's a trace point. Then I'm going to do a debug, start debugging. It asks me to enter my name. It says hello Walt. And now if I come over here to my output window and scroll down to the end, you may not see this window in your computer. If you don't, you need to go to View Output. And here at the bottom of the window is my custom output string. And notice that it didn't stop my code from running. So that's trace points. Another common task that you might want to do when you're debugging is you might need to have an application already running before you attach a debugger. In other words, you don't want to attach the debugger at the startup process. Or another thing is happening is you're running an application, and 5 or 6 hours after you started running it, something happens that doesn't look right. And at that point, you want to start attaching the debugger and taking a look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this attached to console application directly. To do that, I'm going to right-click, choose Open Folder in Windows Explorer, open my bin folder and my debug folder, and run this attached to console. I'll show you how it works. I'll type in my name, and there's the same code we saw before. Now it's sitting there waiting for my input. I can go back to Visual Studio, go to my debug menu, and say Attach to Process. This dialog shows me all of the running processes on my computer. I'm going to look for one called Attach to Console.exe. That's the one that I'm currently running. And then I'm going to click Attach. F9, put that breakpoint here. Then I'll go back here and press the Enter key, which caused the next line of code to run. And as you can see, it's now hit my breakpoint. And now at this point, I can do any of my normal debugging tasks. I can take this yellow marker and move it to a previous line. I can examine the data in the variables and so on. For my next demonstration, I want to show you how to debug an ASP.NET website. So let me close this application by clicking this Stop button. And then I'm going to go over to my solution and right-click on the Debug Web App and tell it to make that my startup object. Now this is a ASP.NET application. So one of the things that you have to do to make an ASP.NET application debuggable is add a line of code to your web.config. By default, Visual Studio does that automatically for you when you create a web project. If it doesn't have a debugging setting, then it'll prompt you and say, would you like to modify the web.config? So I've already done that on this application. So all I should have to do is open up this window here, and I'll show you the bit of code I have here. I have an ASP button in here that has a button click procedure. And if I press F7, you can see the code behind. This is the ASP page. Here's the code behind for that. And I've added a breakpoint on this line here where I'm getting the date time and putting it in this label. I've also written a JavaScript button down here. Here's an input button. And it has an on click, which says you need to run this JavaScript called show message, which is up here. And I've added a breakpoint in my HTML for this JavaScript. So what this is showing is that I can also debug client-side code in ASP.NET applications. So I've got 2 breakpoints, right? I need to attach a debugger, so I'll choose Debug, Start Debugging. Visual Studio will launch the ASP.NET development server, and then it'll launch my web browser. It attaches the browser to this instance of Internet Explorer, and now when I click on this button, you'll see that it switches me over to the code behind, and I can hover over the variables here. I can press F11. I can rewind my code just like before. Seeing my output information here, just all my locals and watch windows all work just the way you'd expect. And I'm going to press F5 to continue. And now I'm going to click on this button here, which has the JavaScript code. And again, you'll see it's hitting my breakpoint in my HTML page. And again, I can hover over these items, press F11 to step through the code, and so on. Very handy and a welcome addition to web development. All in all, I'd say that Visual Studio contains a nice selection of debugging tools. In the next movie, I'll show you the IntelliTrace tool, which changes the way you think about debugging.